You're listening to the Creative Process Podcast. Here you will discover what drives musicians to create music and how they realize that ambition. I'm your host, Jamie Collin, founder of the online independent music magazine, Overblown. This episode is sponsored by Indie Tracks. Indie Tracks is a celebration of independent, creative, and DIY pop music. It takes place on a heritage steam railway site in the heart of the Derbyshire countryside from the 28th to the 30th of July 2017. Go to indietracks.co.uk for more information. In the independent interview I read with you recently, you mentioned Neil Young and how he is obviously quite fearless when it comes to creativity. And it immediately reminded me of a quote I read by him. I think he said it sometime in the 70s, and he was talking about the song Heart of Gold. And he says, "This song put me in the middle of the road. Traveling there soon became a bore, so I headed for the ditch."
So I drove, headed for the ditch, yes. I know that quite well, and that's always been an inspirational one for me. The way I would put it is just I think that the worst place to exist as an artist of any kind is in your comfort zone. The creative process should be uncomfortable. It should be challenging. It should be difficult, because otherwise you make comfortable art. That's kind of wallpaper as far as I'm concerned, you know.
Over the last couple of albums, have you found you feel maybe you're kind of heading into it was too comfortable, maybe?
No, I mean I don't want to criticize the last couple of records I've done too much. And here's the thing. Okay, so every time I made a new record as a solo artist, I've always tried to kind of not repeat myself, you know, which I'd like to think I've succeeded in doing. Each record has taken a slightly different thing. But having said that, all the 6 records I've made have sort of operated within the same kind of parameters, you know, in different parts of that ballpark, but in the same ballpark. And in particular, Positive Songs, the last record I did, to me was quite consciously, I wanted it to be a bit of a kind of like a restatement of principles, you know what I mean? Stripping things back down and just sort of to the basics of what it is that I do. So, which I did, and then having done that, and I like to think been successful with it on a creative level, the question is, what do you do now? And I felt like it was time at that moment to start casting my gaze further afield.
Approaching that now, do you think that having made the decision that you're going to mix things up a bit, does it worry you at all about how that might be received by fans, or do you try and keep that outside of the creative process?
I try and keep it outside of the creative process. I mean, I'm not always successful in that. It wanders across the mind, but I feel very strongly that, like, the least honest thing I could do would be to try and make music to please my fans. Mm-hmm. It's always been a case of me. It's not quite the right way to say to please myself, but making music that is as good as my own creative judgment can make it. And I think that if the moment that you start trying to make music to please the fans, or the record label, or indeed your girlfriend, or to try and sell records, that's what selling out is. You know, it would be dishonest of me to say that it never wanders across my mind, and I have a suspicion that there are going to be some people who like my music who won't like this new album. But maybe I'm wrong about that. I don't know. Time will tell.
I've been to a couple of your live shows, and they're very, very passionate.
Yeah.
So I'm sure they'll make themselves heard.
Yeah, no, I'm sure they will. But at the same time, I like to think that they are people who sort of appreciate that following my artistic instinct and my artistic gut, if you like, has got me to the place where I am at the moment. And it sort of seems like it would be the worst thing I could do would be to start ignoring that, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. It's always struck me as well as a songwriter who's more concerned with like emotion and feeling rather than, you know, technicality, or not saying that the music isn't technical, but you know what I mean. It's more concerned with the emotion behind it. And it seems to me that if you intend to mix things up a bit, then you'll have to become a bit more analytical. What do you think about that?
Well, I mean, on some levels, I've been very analytical about songwriting for a long time. I mean, I like to think of songwriting as a consideration divorced from any genre tags as being the kind of the work of my adult life. Do you know what I mean? And I've spent a lot of my life disassembling songs for other people, and indeed trying to construct ones of my own, and looking at the technicalities of songwriting. I mean, songwriting, like all forms of art, has a craft side to it as well as an art side. And I've been an assiduous student of the craft side of songwriting a very long time now, you know. that's always been there to a degree. You know, I don't want to, and have not, and am not pushing myself sort of into an artificial place just for the sake of being different. That's not quite what I'm talking about. Songwriting is not just about the lyrics; it's about the sounds that you make, you know, and the melodies and all that kind of thing. And I'm trying to sort of find new ways of presenting what I do in order to say new things. And yeah, it feels right. I mean, you know, the record is, as I say, is not finished as yet. I've recorded a big pile of material, and I'm going to go back and record a little bit more soon because I have a couple more songs that I want to get down, and we need to mix things and see where it goes. But I'm definitely very pleased with it, and it doesn't sound artificial or forced to me.
It doesn't, because you were saying that you were in the interview as well. Mentioned something about like that it could completely fall in its space, but it's going well so far.
Sure. Well, I mean that interview was given before I was in the studio for a month, and I was concerned before I went about like whether or not I actually meaningfully knew how to make the kind of music that I wanted to try and make this time around. I'm pleased to report that as far as I'm concerned, it was a success. There is still a chance it will fall in its face from a sort of public reception, critical reception, and indeed sort of commercial point of view, but those are things that I do my best not to think about.
And could you give us a bit of a hint about the direction? I know you probably don't want to give too much of the
I don't want to get too far into it. I mean, I've always had a taste in more kind of electronic-based music, and I've always had a taste in soul music, and those two things have been impinging on my creative territory. But I don't want to say too much more because I think it'll be more fun for people to just hear it.
I read as well that you were talking about that it might have a little bit more political, social, or political subject matter.
Yeah.
And you mentioned the song Ghost Town, which I feel is obviously a very political song, but it's because of the way it's written, the way the lyrics are written, it's not adherent to one era. So even though it's written about Margaret Thatcher, I guess, and that era, it's more universal and timeless in that. And is that a kind of approach you would be thinking about taking?
Yeah, I mean, in all the times in my life when I have consciously tried to write political music, to me the divide is between Bob Dylan and Phil Ochs. Mm-hmm. And Phil Ochs was a great songwriter, but Phil Ochs wrote political songs that were incredibly specific to the 1960s, and as a result, almost immediately sounded dated. Yeah. Whereas Dylan, a song like Master of War or whatever, is timeless because he uses a borderline biblical language, and it's I think it's specifically written to be not tethered to a certain time and place. And as a result, everybody knows who Bob Dylan is, and not that many people know who Phil Ochs is.
Absolutely.
Or was. So I think that's an interesting point to consider. I mean, I've sort of used the word political in a couple of interviews about the record, and I'm not entirely sure that's quite what I mean. Mm-hmm. I think the thing is, like the last two albums I made, Tape Deck Heart and Positive Songs, were both with the benefit of a little bit of hindsight, were kind of flip sides of the coin, and they were both albums about affairs of the heart, and they were introspective records. And I think that this is a record that is much more about what's happening in the world around me as opposed to what's happening inside my own head. Whether or not that qualifies it as political or not, I suppose, is for other people to judge in the final thing. And like, it's certainly not a Rage Against the Machine album. And also, I mean, for whatever it's worth, my politics are aggressively centrist, and I think that the thing that, I suppose one of the major themes of the record is sort of that the feeling of fear and insecurity that I certainly am feeling more strongly now than I've ever felt in my life, with the way that the world has been going the last few years. And talking about kind of wanting to try and sort of maintain some sort of foothold in the center ground, because I feel that when the world spreads to the extremes, then sooner or later dialogue becomes impossible and it is replaced by violence. Yeah. And that is not a thing that I think anybody with any degree of sense or political maturity should be in favor of. So, that's my politics, essentially. Yeah. It's quite difficult to write a stirring, fist-pumping anthem on the subject of keep talking to each other and don't be extreme. Do you know what I mean? But I guess I've given it a go.
Yeah, but it's an interesting kind of angle to be taken, I think, because it does seem to me that the people are on both sides of the coin are kind of getting more and more extreme, and dialogue is becoming less and less possible. It's like slanging matches on Twitter, and obviously people now feel that behind the anonymity of the internet, they can say whatever they want, and that just gets in the way of conversation.
Absolutely, yeah. No, I mean the level of political discourse in the world, the Western world, certainly right now is staggeringly shitty. And I'm ecumenical, I suppose. Do you know what I mean? It's just that idea of like just trying to make sure that I was brought up to believe, and I believe very strongly, that the smarter you are, the less sure of your opinions you are. And I think a lot of people would do well to remember that fact. Yeah.
The wise man knows he's a fool.
Well, precisely, and the more you bang on about how right you are about something, the more it makes me think that you don't know exactly what you're talking about.
with your music, I love the rousing nature of the music. It's very, infectious, great in a live setting. But the thing that kind of drew me kind of extra in, you know what I mean? The clincher would have been the lyrics, for things like, say, Long Live the Queen, Wessex Boy, and Four Simple Words, particularly something like Wessex Boy. Like, I'm Irish, and I'm from Cork in Ireland, and you're from Wessex in England, not a million miles away from each other. But, I could really identify to the song, even though traditionally, as an Irishman, people be like...
Yeah, no, well, and to make it worse, I'm not just an Englishman, I'm a Southern Englishman, so my apologies for that.
I was wondering what writers or lyricists would have influenced you?
One of my biggest sort of early lyrical influences was Adam Duritz from Counting Crows.
Oh, yeah.
I got into Counting Crows because my older sister played Always and Everything After until her cassette broke, and then had to buy another copy when we were growing up. I learned how to play all the songs in it, slightly to sort of pacify her whenever I was playing guitar in my bedroom. And I just, he has this sort of wonderful confessional style, and he has a really sort of open sense of imagery. Do you know what I mean? He'll just sort of throw something out there which is so wide open. I mean, off the top of my head, there's a skeleton in every man's house, beneath the dust and love and sweat that hangs on everybody, there's a dead man trying to get out. It's phenomenal lyrics. So that was a big influence for me as a kid. I guess that gave me a taste for the confessional style. Do you know what I mean? My favorite thing in a lyric is when somebody says something that's unretractable. And as a result, I've never had much time for this sort of smirking irony of an awful lot of indie records, if you know what I mean. And actually, funny enough, having said that, I'm a big Pulp fan, and my favorite bit of Pulp is the bit in Common People when Jarvis Cocker drops the smirk and actually says what he fucking means. And, he goes, "You will never understand how it feels to live your life with no meaning or control." And it's so much more powerful because he's been slightly offbeat and sort of ironic for the rest of the song, and then it lands. The other two massive influences to mention on my lyric writing would be, first of all, are you familiar with Arab Strap?
Yeah, I wouldn't be overly familiar with their music, though.
Yeah, the Scottish indie band. They're essentially a two-piece. One guy does the music, and a guy called Aidan Moffat, who's a poet, does the lyrics. He, again, has a very sort of kitchen sink confessional style that I've always adored. Big fan of his. And then probably my biggest lyrical influence and musical influence, and sort of a friend of mine, although it's quite hard for us to hang out on a level because I'm so influenced by the music he's made. But there's a singer called John K. Sampson, who used to be in a Canadian band called the Weaker Bands.
Oh, I know.
And now makes solo records. And you know how true music fans sort of reject the question, what's your favorite band of all time? Because how could you answer that question? Well, you know what? I've gone out the other side of that. Fuck it. The Weaker Bands are my favorite band of all time.
Fair enough. Like you mentioned there as well, a kitchen sink earlier on, and that definitely kind of an Alan Bennett vibe to the lyrics as well. For me, I would have thought about that, and someone like Evan Dando, even I think Evan Dando is a hugely underrated songwriter and lyricist.
Yes, I could not agree more. I'm a huge Evan Dando fan. I actually toured with him back in 2008. He was playing solo, and so was I. And it was he's a really, really wonderful songwriter.
It's like these little attention, small little kind of inconsequential even details. I think is what I like.
Yeah, definitely.
They seem inconsequential, but they actually have quite significance then,
Yeah. It's the zoom in, zoom out trick. And I think that John K. Sampson is the absolute master of it, in my opinion. He says something like duct tape and soldered wire, new words for old desires. And, that might be the most perfect lyric of all time.
Obviously find yourself in a bit of an unknown space heading into this record. Is it how do you feel? Is it kind of exciting or frightening or
It is exciting. Yeah, it's exciting. It's a wonderful feeling to be 6 albums in and to be 35 years old and feeling just as creatively driven as I was when I was 23, And it's a funny thing because I think there is an awful lot of people have an awful lot of songwriters have a moment of inspiration in their sort of mid-20s that never quite comes back to them. And maybe I'm being completely delusional in saying this, and maybe that people are going to say that I had that moment in my mid-20s and now I'm talking out my arse. But on a personal level, I feel just as kind of fired up and driven and infused by the creative process as I ever have done. And I feel very fortunate for that, to still have that, And there are some songwriters who keep writing good songs for their whole lives. And I would love to be one of them. It's not really up to me. Obviously, I'll try, but we'll see how the muses
goes. To be creative, though, or you do have to be a bit delusional, I think.
Oh, completely. And I think, well, one of the things, there's a lot of things that have changed in my life in the time that I've been a songwriter, you know, which has been the majority of my life. But like, I think one of the ways that I have put it in the past is that like, as I get older, the inspiration gets harder to dig out because you don't want to repeat yourself. But once you've found the inspiration, it becomes easier to then turn that into a meaningful piece of music because you've got better at the craft side of things. But the other thing that I've started noticing, particularly for me right now, is just as I get older, I just care less about what other people think, you know, and it's just like at this point right now, I'm not sure I would have been ready to make the record I'm making right now 5 years ago or indeed 10, you know, and it feels wonderful. It's kind of liberating for me to just kind of go, who gives a shit? The degree of establishment as an artist is quite, you know, and some people sort of talk about how that's bad and you should always be hungry and that kind of thing. But one of the things about a degree of establishment as an artist, it means that I just kind of feel I can do whatever the fuck I want. I'm not chasing fame and success.
Yeah, it's a liberating place to be in, I imagine. No, it does seem to me, I guess, that like a lot of musicians kind of, by the time maybe 35 or 40, they do kind of reel it in a bit, start to release less music. They start to kind of wind down, I guess.
There are elements of my life that are slowing down a bit, but that is a simple biological function of getting older. I still tour pretty hard, but I don't tour like I did when I was in my 20s anymore, and for good reason, which is that I couldn't. My physical health and my voice and all the rest of it wouldn't survive. And you know, and I've built more of a life for myself. I've got a home to go to and a girlfriend to go to and all the rest of it. Well, that then brings me on to a slightly different topic, which I know wasn't what we were just talking about, but fuck it. Here we go. Like, you know, one of the things I've become increasingly interested in is like so much of rock and roll lyricism is focused on issues and events and mindsets that occur between about the ages of 16 and 25. And that's all well and good, but I'm kind of bored of that after a while. And part of the reason I like Elvis Costello or Nick Cave or people like that is that they write about adult issues as well. And like there are plenty of pop punk bands who put out records talking about high school when they have band members in their 40s. Yeah. And I think that's kind of fucking lame, actually. You know what I mean? I think
even a bit weird, like.
Yeah, and I think that songwriting and the kind of music I make I feel like it should be a bold enough art form to sustain conversation about adult themes, and therefore I will try and pursue them.
Well, I think you're in a kind of good spot to pursue that, because there's other styles of music maybe that aren't as conducive to essentially growing up. Like, I mean, if you take a band like, say, Korn, who've essentially been, you know, singing the same song for 20, 30 years or something at this stage, but they don't, like, I mean, it's not that it's their fault, they created their own sound, but like, they've nowhere to go because of the type of sound it was, you know?
Yeah, sure. I mean, they are very much. I love the first Korn album, but they will forever be a name written on a school backpack.
Absolutely. Like, I don't mean to be. I'm not like having a go at Korn necessarily. Like, you know what I mean? I'm just saying that because of the type of music and the confessional nature of the lyrics, it is conducive to attacking more kind of mature themes, I think.
Well, I mean, I think that, you know, I'm not sure it was fully conscious rather than subconscious, but when I made the decision to start playing acoustic guitar and do it on my own back in 2005, I think that there was a degree to which it was just kind of like, this feels like a thing I could do for the rest of my life, whereas being in a shouty, angular political hardcore band maybe wasn't. Yeah,
it kind of has a certain amount of a shelf life.
Yeah, exactly.
Unless you're in the Rolling Stones or something and you just decide you're going to pretend to be 25 for the rest of your life. But like, I suppose, like, talking about Million Dead, it's not like, this isn't the first time, I suppose, that you've had a bit of a change in style, you know? And there was, I don't know.
Yeah, and I suspect that this one might be slightly less radical than the change from Million Dead to playing solo acoustic music. But then again, I mean, I didn't really think about it in that change in those terms, and I'm not really thinking about this one in those terms either. I'm not doing it for the sake of impressing people with my diversity. I'm doing it because that's where the muse leads, and that's the kind of sound I want to make, you know? Yeah,
you kind of feel it's time.
Yeah.
Because I suppose like 6 albums of, like, as you say, they are quite diverse, and some of them are quite minimal, just, you know, guitar, some of them are quite full band sounds, but as you say, it was kind of under the same umbrella.
Right, exactly, you know, and and there are a couple of tracks on the new record, although I'm not entirely sure what songs have been in the record, which aren't, so there will probably be a couple of tracks on the new record which are still in that umbrella zone or whatever, but there's quite a lot that aren't, and that makes me feel good.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Creative Process Podcast. Make sure to check out the show notes in our podcast section at overblown.co.uk. Here you will find links to everything mentioned in this episode. Overblown and the Creative Process podcast are both an entirely DIY venture. If you enjoyed the podcast, you can become a patron of Overblown at patreon.com/Overblown. See you down the front.